Good morning and welcome to the webinar on the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. My name is Dean Dick at the Ag Info Center, and I'm going to be hosting this webinar. A couple of housekeeping items before I turn it over to our presenters and organizer. On your panel, you have a question panel where you can type in a question for our presenter. The questions will be handled at the end of the presentation. So as you're going through, if you've got any questions, just type them in and send them, and then our other organizer will read them out. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording probably tomorrow to view the webinar if you want to again. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Carrie Ann, who is going to introduce our speaker. Carrie Ann.
Great. Thanks, Dean. Everyone, welcome to the Sustainability webinar series. Hopefully you've been able to attend one of these in the past. If this is the first one, welcome. My name is Carrie Ann Kohler-Monroe, and I'm an environmental program specialist with the Environmental Stewardship Branch here in Agriculture and Forestry. And today it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter. Susie Miller is an executive director of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. Susie has worked extensively with the Canadian agriculture and food industry with over 30 years of experience with agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, as well as working for Saskatchewan agriculture and industry associations. In her last position with AAFC, she was the Director General responsible for departmental interface with industry associations, including the establishment and managing of value chain roundtables. So again, I wanted to reiterate, questions will be answered after the presentation, and you can type them into the question box. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Susie.
Thank you, Carrie Ann, and thank you to everybody for taking the time. I know that you're all busy, so I will get right into it. The Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops was formed in 2013. For those of you who are familiar with the Canadian Roundtable on Sustainable Beef, it was formed at the same time and using a similar process. The Roundtable for Sustainable Beef was developed by the Beef Value Chain Roundtable and the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops through the Grains Roundtable. So essentially we're looking at, in terms of our vision, the Canadian grain sector is recognized globally to be economically viable, socially responsible, and a leader in the adoption of environmentally sustainable production. And what we're trying to do is to create value for all members of the supply chain. Now, our scope, it says crops. We do not cover horticulture. Our focus is not on special crops, but smaller volume crops, but we do focus on grains, oilseeds, and pulses. And some of our information is relevant to the rest of field crops. So how are we set up? Well, we're member driven. We try to be very inclusive, and for purposes of governance, we have 6 categories of membership. So we have producer organizations, and those are both national and provincial. For example, they might be commodity based at the provincial level, Sask wheat, Alberta canola, but it also includes the canola growers, grain farmers of Ontario, etc. The supply chain commodity organizations, most of which are heavily supported by the producers. That would include organizations like Cereals Canada, Pulse Canada, the Canola Council. Grain marketers, so these would be individual companies. Input suppliers from mainly the fertilizer side and the crop life side. We also have customers, less food processors than we would wish, but we have the Animal Nutrition Association of Canada. We had some food service such as McDonald's, and as well we have a category for retailers, but we have not been able to engage them yet. And then our sixth category we call them sustainability non-governmental organization like Ducks Unlimited. We have researchers like the Western Grain Research Foundation and some sustainability certifier bodies. Just to make a note, we don't have governments as members, but we definitely partner with them. They are welcome at our meetings and they are members of our committees. So we have a steering committee, which is representative of the membership, which provides the strategic direction. And we're member funded, although our annual membership fees are sufficiently low that the Canada Grain Council provides additional support as well as administration assistance to us. So that's kind of who we are. But this is why we are. And all of this you likely know. But the reason I have it here is because it really makes a difference in what we do and how we do it. So export-oriented, definitely. What Canadian buyers want are congruent with international buyers. So we have a world focus instead of a Canadian focus when it comes to direction for our work. And of course, the grains industry is bulk handling based. So we're not in the same position, for example, as beef, where through the traceability system, you can actually identify a chain of custody. And we have over 120,000 producers that have sold grains in the last several years. So our markets are looking for sustainable production. They are not requiring individual farm certification, except for a few limited markets. Even those that are IP protected, for example, non-GMO soybeans, they're not looking for the sustainability aspect. They're just looking for the crop integrity. And there are standard-based farm assurance protocols available for use if required. So we're not in that particular business. We're focused on the aggregate rather than the individual. And I'll get into kind of how we do this. So what do we do? Well, first and foremost is alignment within the industry. So really, when it comes to the grains industry, the first thing that was embarked upon is what is sustainability? What is it that we want to talk about? What is it we want to support? What is it we want to encourage? So a common definition, and then from that came the measurement. But it's also the identification of priority research using the strength of all of the members that we have. We get different points of view. And we do not coordinate member activities, but we try to integrate them. And as I go further, I'll have some specific examples. The second part is dialogue and outreach, and this is beyond our members. There are many grain organizations. I'm sure even within Alberta, it is a challenge to get one voice, and it's helpful that there is now a Team Alberta with the canola, wheat, barley, and pulses. But when you try to do this across Canada, we wanted to be able to join others at the table and have a stronger voice through consolidation. And we're working proactively with governments, researchers, and customers to talk about sustainability and to encourage them to interact with us. The third part, which has been the focus of our work for the last 2 years, is sustainability performance measurement. How are we doing? Once we have the common definition, how do we actually measure that? And this is underlying research that we undertook, plus tools for the use by the industry. So I'm going to get into our major tool. As I said, it has been the focus of our work. What we found was throughout this whole process in the early years, there needed to be easily accessible, coherent, and consistent. I think we got the consistent down. We have the somewhat accessible. We hope it's coherent, but please beware, it's a work in progress. So we worked to identify and develop fact-based information, and we wanted it to respond to market requirements. So what we did was we looked at those indicators and measurements of sustainability that were being used internationally and have been used for some time. On the beef side, there was a global roundtable, and that helped them define. Plus, they had a few major customers, not in the same situation on the grain side, because it tends to be region-specific and crop-specific. So what we used was the International Sustainability and Carbon Certification, the ISCC. And this is used by Europe, by the European Union. And in fact, canola has to pass this certification to permit canola to be sold as a biofuel into the EU. The SCI platform, Farm Sustainability Assessment, and this is not only is it a code, as it were, but it's also a benchmarking, and it started first on the crop side, moving to horticulture, and now they're just moving to the animal industry. And the next three were developed to respond to specific issues. Unilever was one of the first ones to develop the Sustainable Agriculture Code, and they were getting pressure on palm oil. And the Roundtable for Responsible Soy started in response to issues in South America. And the fifth one that we used is the European Union Feed Association Soy Sourcing Guidelines. Now, all of them have a lot in common. And in fact, if we were going to choose one that we would use, if we only had one to choose, we would choose the SCI platform, Farm Sustainability Assessment, for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that all of the others are benchmarked against it. So that's where we started on the metrics platform. We use three kinds of data, and we use these three types of data because they were the types of data that were available, but they also can substitute for the individual producer, because all of those standards that I talked about are individual producer based. We're moving to an aggregate. Legal and program infrastructure is really important. And in fact, under the SCI platform, you can achieve the first level, which is bronze status, just on legal infrastructure alone, if it meets all of the requirements. And it can be used significantly on the other two levels. We also wanted to include aggregate outcomes of the activities of the industry. And some of those types of things would be the greenhouse gas footprint, and it would be the amount of land under tillage, for example. And then we have aggregated practices of producers, which are done through various surveys. And I hope you don't mind if I spend some time on this, because I have an ask for you at the end of this. So we do use public data. That's our first source. We used Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's agro-environmental indicators, which provided a lot of information for us. Last updated in 2011, currently being updated now. Statistics Canada, whether it was a census, the Farm Environmental Management Survey, the Water Use Survey, etc., and provincial and federal regulations. We also used Environment and Climate Change Canada. But we also undertook our own analysis. One of this was a survey of 1,600 grain producers in 2017, which include all the aspects of sustainability. What we were trying to do was to fill a few gaps, but also to update. There's a big difference in 6 years from 2011 to 2017, and the last Statistics Canada Farm Environmental Management Survey was conducted in 2011. We also undertook the carbon, it should be LCA analysis, not LCL analysis, life cycle analysis for 10 crops across the country, and I'm going to be actually showing you on the platform some of the results from that. The industry also has excellent data. Fertilizer use surveys that were done as part of the Canadian Field Print Initiative. There's Field Print Initiative Sustainability report, but there's also work that's being done on some of the social areas like farm safety. The data time frame we used most recent, as I indicated, some is only available in 2011, but we've been able to update to 2018. And because continuous improvement is important, we've used time series if it is available. In the geographic area, we have focused on the provinces. We've done every province except Newfoundland. They only have 1,000 acres of grain, and actually when we started this, they didn't have any. We've also gone to sub-provincial in the larger provinces, and I will give you an indication of that when I do the demonstration. And we have 10 crops. We split spring wheat, winter wheat, and durum, and then canola, barley, corn, peas, lentils, oats, and soybeans. I just want to make sure I got them all. And flax, yes. So in terms of what we've tried to do, fact-based, but we wanted to make sure that, as I said, that we filled the gaps where the data wasn't available, and the plan is to update it as information, new information becomes available. For example, Statistics Canada did undertake a farm management survey in 2018 that included a lot of the environmental questions that we'll be able to use the results from that survey. We try to update. The latest updates I did was on minimum wage, and I was able to use 2018 data. So this is what we ended up. Oh, I'm sorry. I go back previous. Sorry. This is what we ended up with, and this is a very ugly graphic, but it's basically we're focused on 3 measures of sustainability: social responsibility, environmental sustainability, and economic viability. So the social responsibility, because of the origin of many of these international standards, where most of the labor was not provided by the owner-operator, but provided by hired labor, there's a lot about working conditions and labor relations. We've extended the work safety and security to include everybody that works on the farm, including the owner-operator and their families. And then under community relations, again, it's a situation where the farms in Canada are the community, but there are some issues such as dust and smoke and noise and land tenure. On the financial viability, we have one report. Excuse me. It's basically about the economic viability, the financial viability of the farms, and then we have categorized everything else into the seven issues on sustainability. Just a note, even though some of the international standards include food safety, we chose not to include it here because it was out of scope for the metrics platform. So I am now going to take you rapidly through 2 of the reports, the greenhouse gas emissions and air quality, and I think I'll do agrochemical management. Just to give you a flavor, obviously it'll have to go quickly, but you can see what it was that we were trying to do and you can make your own assessment as to whether or not it actually was successful. So this is our website. So we have the social responsibility, environmental sustainability, and economic viability, plus on the bottom we have some other features, but it contains all of the same information. So if I were going to go into environmental sustainability, excuse me, I just have to move this over. We're given all the 7 reports. And clicking on the 7 reports, any one of the 7 reports will take us deeper into it. So this is the greenhouse gas emissions and air quality. We've combined the 2 of them together. We give a sort of a summary about why it's an issue and what it means and what you're likely to find it. We also have a feature in here where you can sort out for each of those 10 crops I identified and each of those 10 areas. So when you're going through, the text will remain the same, but for example, if we have a table that says prairies and you pressed Ontario, that table will not come up. So as I said, we started with an introduction, and then we have what we call the Canadian perspective. So this is our story. What we've done is we've started with key messages. And for several reasons. One is to give the reader an identification of what information is there, but it's also a conclusion. So that what we've said is that we've improved our carbon footprint from 1981 to 2011. And sorry, the reason is 2011 was we're using Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada data, and 2011 is the latest data that they currently have available. The other thing is that we do source all of our material. Up here you see little 7. So at the bottom we have everything sourced and links where there are links, so that somebody that wants to get more in depth into the information can do that. So for example, we have a lot of tables there. So if we were going to take, I'd say prairie spring wheat, this is Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's indicator. What we have done is the data is downloadable on CSV, and we also have by scrolling across, the actual numbers are available for anybody who's using it. The second one, the carbon footprints vary across Canada due to production practices and climate. This is our CRSC survey, our study actually, analysis. It's based on Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada information. It is peer reviewed. It was peer reviewed, and it is according to international standards in terms of the methodologies. So we did 10 crops across the country, and they were done in every what we call a regional unit where there was more than 100,000 acres. So if I were going to take a look at barley, for example, and if you click on this little thing here, that shows you that in Alberta, the RUs, which are regional units, are 34, 35, 37, and 39. I gotta get this thing closed. Right. Okay. So this is the greenhouse gas. Let's take 34. The energy use, this is kilograms per ton. Blue is a seed and pesticide. Fertilizing manufacturing is 67. Green is the energy use. Nitrous oxide emissions is the pink, and the change in soil organic carbon, which is actually a negative emission, so that the total amount of emissions is less than 200 kilograms per ton. This information, and for example, if we were going to use something like Durham, You can see it's a much smaller. It's only Alberta and Saskatchewan. The variations are due to all sorts of things. Some of the things are constant. For example, or almost constant, the energy use. We also undertook a fertilizer manufacturing study to do the greenhouse gas of fertilizer manufacturing. So that is our greenhouse gas. It's used quite extensively. It's being used nationally in the Clean Fuel Standard to measure the impacts, and the Government of Canada finds it very useful because they don't really have anything that detailed. And just to give you a little bit more information, we have, for example, we talk about nitrogen emissions because it is the most significant greenhouse gas, so we have more detailed information. And I'll just pick components of nitrogen emission in durum wheat, and it shows that crop residue produces the orange portion, and synthetic fertilizers the rest. There's just to give you a sense of how we've used in this. There's more. There's a whole section on organic carbon sinks, which of course varies across the country. We have one on energy use. The fact that, for example, this happens to be winter wheat. I haven't added them all. That shows that over time the energy use per hectare has increased, but the energy use per ton of production has actually decreased. Air quality is part of it, and this is how we have used our producer survey. So for that one, we're using aggregate outcomes. This is aggregated data. And this was a question: have you eliminated crop residue burning on your farm? This was part of our survey. For BC and Alberta, by the way, it's mainly Alberta. There may be a few in the piece from BC, but it's mainly Alberta. And this is based on our survey that was conducted in 2017. So I'm just going to go back and I will show you agrochemical management. And for our purposes, agrochemical management is pesticides. So this one is a little different. For one, we do talk about regulation a lot. We talk about pesticide registration. We talk about how the Pest Management Regulatory Agency does its work. We talk about provincial legislation, and then we have information on the legislation. For example, in Alberta, it's the Environmental Protection Enhancement Act, the Pesticide Sales, Handling, and Use of Application Regulation, and then we've included a link. We've done that for each province. And we're focusing a lot here on the adoption of best management practices. And so again, this happens to be the aggregated producer information rather than an aggregate outcome, because we don't have that information there. And we talk about application and we talk about disposal and various things, again, that are following from the what the international standards are. For example, this happens to be Statistics Canada 2011 sprayer calibration. And it's national because that's the only information we have. But based on our survey, one is clean spray equipment away from water sources. And again, Alberta, always and often, it's the majority of it. Just to also, before I move back to the general presentation, I want to show you the other two features. I mentioned the sources, so the sources are all listed at the bottom. But we also have industry initiatives. So the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops does not have a mandate to work directly with industry. to improve and enhance sustainability performance, our members do that. So what we have done in each of the reports, we've identified the industry initiatives that apply to this. So we have on this one a lot on the clean farms, because the Clean Farm program does a lot about the disposal of pesticides, and we have the environmental farm plan. And we identified from a survey that was done in Alberta, actually based on the across Canada, that talks about all provincial environmental farms plan cover things like crop rotation, pest management, pesticide handling, storage, and disposal, and almost all of them cover riparian area and equipment maintenance. And then I mentioned earlier about the global sustainability requirements that kind of drove the type of information that's available on the platform. So what we have done, these are the 5 that I mentioned, there are links to them. But for anybody that wants to understand, for example, what are they looking for in terms of cleaning and disposal of agrochemicals and containers, this is the type of thing that they're looking for. Or pest and disease resistance, they're looking at choice, they're looking at variation in types of chemicals, they're looking at crop disease cross-contamination, etc. So this is just to give you a flavor. As I said, there's all sorts of features. There's one where you can go into the source data and you can actually see it by data collection rather than by through an individual report. So I'm going to close that and go back to this, and I'm almost done. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of what we found. So in agrochemical management, the strong legislation is helpful for registration and availability, but the international standards are really looking for certification for application, and not all provinces require that for owner-operators. Although the practices are good from everything we've been able to survey, there's a lot of expectation of integrated pest management. What we found is that many practices of IPM are followed, but it's not language that's used in the grains industry. There is some vulnerability in herbicides desiccants because there is an expectation that pesticides will be used in a targeted way. On nutrient management, the standards emphasize manure management for all sorts of reasons, and that includes storage. We include the application, but not the storage. What we found, for those of you who are aware of the 4R nutrient management program, if you follow that program, you pretty well hit everything. Documented practices are strong, including the use of soil test, which is higher than most people expected, but there is a strong emphasis. On soil quality and productivity, the adoption of no-till has basically won the case for us, but of course it is not consistent across the country. The adoption in Eastern Canada is much lower. On the water quality and quantity, there's a heavy emphasis in these international standards on irrigation. We're only about 2%, and I've used a lot of Alberta information to identify the practices we've been able to get from the water use survey, but also the government framework is extremely helpful. Water quality is very limited. It's probably one of our biggest gaps. We know that there are some issues, but they may only be regional, but it's not something we're quite as comfortable about. GHG emissions and air quality, I've talked about that. Land use and biodiversity management. The focus here is on land conversion. For example, under the ISCC standards, canola basically has to have it certified that no forest land was converted to use for growing canola. Now, in Canada, we're in a quite different position. In the rainforest, let me put it this way, of the land that is used for agriculture and forestry, 25% is used for agriculture and 75% is used for forestry, and most of our forests are crown land. However, when it comes to biodiversity management, wildlife, we do have endangered species legislation, some question about its implementation. And from Canada's information, the wildlife habitat is a poor performer. We need to do some work on that. And waste and pollution, we're probably fine. On the social responsibility part, work safety and security, we're okay. The working conditions and labor relations, we're probably okay, but the legislation excludes farm workers in many provinces, or at least from some of it. The information we've been able to find is that the wages paid are higher than the minimum wage. So for those who are even not covered under minimum wage, we can make an argument that that doesn't matter because the actual practice is quite solid. And then community relations, financial viability, things are good. So what's next for us? So as I indicated, we've spent a lot of time defining what sustainability is, building the metrics platform, telling the story, but is it time for us to develop achievement goals? Not unlike what the BEEF have done. It's something we're considering. So the second part is communication and outreach. So far we've had about 700 users of the metrics platform, which is astounding, but we're not sure how many of them just go in and, the average time spent is 5 minutes. So what can you do with 5 minutes? We would like this adopted by the major grain companies and customers as a transition to or instead of using individual farm certification. So there's certain things that we could do to improve. There's a lot of things we could do to improve the metrics platform, frankly. But one of them is the inclusion of the 2017 farm management survey results. And we are undertaking a research strategy. We've got to the point of identifying gaps. I mentioned some of those as we went through the presentation. And then we want to, part of what the research committee has to do is outreach to research funders and researchers, because the CRSC is not funded to undertake a significant amount of research, but there are opportunities to inform others. One of the things in terms of the metrics platform, and this is something for you to consider, is that, we had a limited time, limited resources, and we focused on national, we focused on that was easy to find. We believe that there's a lot of data out there, including at the provincial level, that could enhance the platform. It may only be specific to a province, and that's fine. So for any of you research and data gurus, anything that you could provide us would be extremely helpful. If it's not public, that's fine, but anything we put, of course, this is a public site, so it'd have to be releasable. But we would appreciate any contributions that you can make, and of course any of your comments. So for those of you who want to spend some time looking at this, that is what will get you there, metrics.sustainablecrops.ca. And Carrie-Anne, that's all I have to say.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you for that great introduction to the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. I think we've always heard about the Roundtable, but maybe I'm one of those people that have gone to the website but not really fully utilized it. So thank you for that. I know there's lots of people on the line, and I know we have lots of interest. There's been a couple questions come in, so if we can take the next few minutes. I know we have booked till 12 and it's 11:40 right now, so hopefully we can answer most of the questions, if not all of them. I guess, so here's a question. Why do you think you haven't been able to get retailers engaged?
Well, it's really interesting. But let's take a case of the potato French fries. So the French fry manufacturers are working very closely with the potato growers on their sustainability. And in fact, they require that they have an environmental farm plan. That's their focus. They're not focused on the canola oil that's used to manufacture that. So it doesn't have the same pressure. We're fortunate in a way, but it doesn't have the same pressure as beef. Like the McDonald's aren't focused on the wheat in their hamburger bun. They're focused on the meat. So I think that has allowed us a little bit extra time. Nobody questions at the retail level where the grain comes from. It has a reputation for being sustainable. That's my best guess.
Okay. No. There's another question that might be a continuation, or you already alluded to it, is what are the companies, markets, or products that require farm-based certification?
Okay, so right now what we've heard, and oats is one, and these are for human consumption. So Quaker Oats, for example, are considering whether or not by a certain date they're going to require some kind of a sustainability report certification. There are some countries, generally speaking, the countries that we export aren't specifically interested, except for when I talked about canola. Biofuel into the European Union. So there was a survey done 2 years ago where the previous executive director and the president of the Canada Grains Council sat down and in-depth interviewed every one of the major grain companies. Because they're the next interface. They're the interface between the farmers, right, and the users. And what they found was they expected to have to provide sustainability information at some point, but right now, only a small portion of the markets were looking at it. And in terms of certain countries, sometimes what is under the guise of sustainability is really a trade barrier. For example, Italy and glyphosate on durum. That's the issues that they're more concerned about: low-level presence and maximum residue levels.
Okay, thank you. Why was Alberta and BC grouped together in the CRTC survey results reporting?
Okay, so we used a survey company out of Ontario and called Stratus, and he has 16,000 producers that he has grouped by, I guess, by product. And so he sends a survey to them, and he said that he thought in the Alberta number there might have been 3 or 4 BC producers in the piece. He didn't separate them out, but wanted to include them since they replied and considered that they would be consistent. So really that BC Alberta is Alberta plus Peace District, a few from BC.
Okay, great. Has the CRSC informed AF on the research gaps that were identified? I guess this is a good starting point, but yeah, has there been any formal or way to, because I know I remember you mentioning water quality and a couple other ones.
Yeah. So we just had our CRSC meeting last week in Winnipeg, last Thursday. And at that meeting, the research committee had come up with a preliminary list, and we asked the members to provide us with their input in terms of whether it was medium, low, high, add etc. We're compiling that information right now. We have a steering committee meeting towards the end of January. The intention is that we will have the research strategy publicly available by February. But I can tell you that in terms of pesticides, that we're looking at alternatives to pesticides and their effectiveness, buffer zone requirements, cost benefit of beneficials versus pest control. GHG emissions and air quality, definitely updating the study according to the standards, what I think is every 5 years. And we are looking at sort of broader aspects of GHG emissions. We stop at the farm gate. Do we go beyond that? And also the carbon footprint in the carbon footprint of the whole farm. But one other area we're looking at is consequential life cycle assessment. So this is the term I've been told is the appropriate scientific term, but essentially it is, if you undertake a practice, what can you expect to see on your greenhouse gas emissions? And this is to provide information to producers and also on if there was a certain practice undertaken, what impact would it have? Like, for example, growing pulses and rotation, or moving from full tillage to zero till. A lot of discussion around biodiversity. In terms of soil quality and productivity, vertical tillage, there's not a lot known on the impact of vertical tillage, and I think there is concern that it actually can reduce the carbon sink that's we're trying to get sort of credit for, and water quality. So yes, not much different, but the fact that the impact of agriculture practices is a really tough one, because, you know, from Environment Canada did a huge study. They did 153 locations across the country, rivers, I think they were rivers, and they concluded, and they gave them a low, medium, high in terms of water quality, and in improving, deteriorating, no change. And they state that essentially the water quality deteriorates when one of three activities happens: agriculture, urban residence and manufacturing, they've lumped that into one, and mining. But they don't provide any information about how much, where, who, etc. And it's very hard to attribute, and as we've seen in Lake Winnipeg, for example, attributing the water quality in Lake Winnipeg to the hog farms, when a great percentage of it is actual urban waste. So look for it. I'll be sure to send it to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so is the sustainability strategy or the research strategy going to be publicly available, or just within membership?
No, absolutely. The idea is to take a tool, because we also want to leverage the interest of others, but it's also, I think it's a better research work that researchers undertake if they know and understand how it potentially can be used.
Yeah, for sure. I have another question from somebody that will just add to the discussion. So what role is AF as a ministry playing or can play in the CRSC?
Okay, well, first of all, we have had attendance when you've been able to get funding to travel out of province. Our meetings are in Manitoba and Ontario, and in fact, you're not alone in terms of provincial issues. So we do distribute our updates, reports, etc. I think there's several people from Alberta on the list. The second part is the data that I talked about. We also work really closely, when I talk about, we work more closely with some members than others. Eureka, for example, Paul Watson is somebody we work with. He's on our research committee. I know he's not exactly government, but definitely funded by government. And we work with the producer associations, the Alberta Farm Sustainability Extension Initiative. We worked with them. They used the results of our survey, etc. So data, interest, and discussions about research and this kind of forum.
No, that's perfect, and definitely we do work very closely with Erica and Paul Watson, and then just for everybody else's knowledge, I think if you wanted a key contact, Len Kruzanowski has been our department's key contact with the roundtable. So if not contacting you directly, but you're a busy lady, definitely I know Len has been engaged on a continual basis.
But in terms of, like, if anybody would like to be on a distribution list, I send out a newsletter about every 2 months. So, for example, that's where the research strategy would appear, or I'd point you to the right direction. Everybody gets too much email, I am sure, but if you'd like to get one more, please let me know.
Okay, so directly let you know, or you can sign up on the website for that?
No, you have to directly let me know. So okay. My email address is execdir, Executive Director, at sustainablecrops.ca. Our website is sustainablecrops.ca, and our metrics platform is metrics.sustainablecrops.ca.
Wonderful. Thank you. So global roundtables have all members of the supply chain, so processors, retailers. Is there any desire or movement for the CRSC to increase membership? Or how might you be going about that, I guess?
Well, interestingly enough, as part of our steering committee meeting, we're taking a look at the value proposition. Who do we really need at the table to make this work? Given that and I have to tell you, and you mentioned in my introduction, Carrie Ann, that I used to work for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and there are 14 value chain roundtables. And I was chair of all of them but one at some point or another, and engaging the retailers and the food service were probably the most challenging. And they're driven by different issues, and maybe it's not about getting them as members. Maybe it's about making sure that we know and understand, and we have the capacity to learn from what it is that they're doing and how they're doing it, and to have a dialogue before something happens that would disrupt the market.
Okay. Yep, that makes sense. I guess keeping on that train of thought, so global roundtables are aligned by specific commodities usually, so beef, palm oil, soy, you've mentioned those ones. Do you think there's any global impetus for a crops roundtable?
No.
Yeah, okay.
But and you mentioned there are different ones, but one of the things that on the crop side I've been working really hard to do is to engage the animal industry, because as they develop their own sustainability, they use crops to feed their animals. And in fact, for most animal industry, particularly the intensive, it's their largest input in terms of environmental footprint, in terms of cost. So we want to ensure that we're consistent, or that they are using ours consistently. And of course, with beef, we've been working side by side all along. They're not a member of our roundtable, but they always come, and vice versa.
All right, thank you.
But just to finish off the thought, the reason is because markets for each crop are different. And so what you need for canola is not the same as what you need for what you need for soy, or what you need for wheat. And in some cases, they're competitors. So we can't even no, that sounds judgmental. We don't even have a consolidated voice like a grains industry voice in Canada. We now have one through the CRSC on sustainability. So to try to move internationally, we're not in the same position that beef is in at all.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. And you alluded to that, correct. I'm just going to ask this question. I don't have all the background in the environmental farm plan area, so I'll just ask it and see. So the environmental farm plan is mentioned as an option for crop farmers, but not required in any way. Would it not streamline things for the Canadian Roundtable groups? And what is the theory behind not utilizing this already available resource more formally?
Okay, not formally, because we don't have a mandate to push the industry for practice adoption, or we don't even have a mandate for outreach. That belongs to the 100 and so organizations, crop organizations across the country. But we do at our meetings, for example, we do highlight, and we try to bring everybody together. For example, the last time we had a session with, our meeting in May, we had a session on SciPlatform, because we, along with others, benchmarked, I think every province except for BC and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, their legislation has now been benchmarked. We did Manitoba and Quebec, because those were the ones missing in terms of the major grain producing provinces. And we're trying to identify how for those who need the SciPlatform, how far you can go and how you could use our data to supplement that. We also, on the National Environmental Farm Plan Initiative, they speak at our every meeting to provide an update, and I participate on a couple of the committees. What we're trying to do is to strengthen those individual farm plan approaches, or the individual producer certification approaches, without getting into it ourselves. So do we endorse them? No, but there's a lot of information on there on it. So it may be our next step.
Thank you. So one thing, just so people know, Susie had mentioned that if you want the newsletter or your emails that you send out on a regular basis to keep informed, that you can send them an email, or you can send her an email, and hopefully you can see my screen at this point with Susie's email address, as well as the Sustainable Crops website, and then also a heads up to register for the next webinar, which is November 28th with the Alberta sugar beet growers. So we have a couple more questions if we can hang in there. This has been really good. You mentioned on-farm food safety was not in scope. Could you elaborate on this?
Well, one of the requirements is on-farm food safety and traceability. And in the grains industry, unlike a lot of the other commodities, the adoption of the on-farm food safety program that were developed and recognized through CFIA has a very limited adoption. So that the whole food safety and quality is kind of a completely different trajectory, and so that we decided that at least at this stage we would not include it.
That makes sense. I think I'll just leave it for a minute here, but I think that might be actually all the questions that we have right now posted. We're 1 minute to 12. So if anybody has any more questions, please post them quickly. But yeah, I thank you for your availability and your email address. I know people are very engaged and there's a lot of people on the line listening.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. And yes, I expect to hear from all sorts of people. So that would be great, actually.
Wonderful.
Thank you again.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining, and we'll talk next time on the next webinar. Great. Everyone have a great day.